price. If you lead a B2B tech company, you've said those words, your sales team has said those words, and almost everyone in the room nodded and moved on. My guest today thinks that explanation is almost never true. The deal wasn't lost on price, it was lost 6 months earlier. The moment a prospect couldn't tell your company apart from three competitors who all looked, sounded, and charged the same way. Alex Smith is the author of No Bullshit Strategy and the founder of Basic Arts. He works with a small number of founders and CEOs each year, including the likes of brands like Porsche, to answer one question. What is the one thing only your business can deliver, and how do you build everything around it? His argument is deceptively simple and genuinely uncomfortable. Most funded B2B companies don't have a strategy, they have goals. And until that's fixed, no sales hire, no marketing budget, and no operational improvement will make the revenue predictable, because all of them are treating a symptom while the cause sits upstream untouched. This is the Predictable B2B Success Podcast. I'm Vinay Koshi. Let's get into it. Alex, welcome to the show. Before I dive into questions, I want to give listeners who haven't come across your work a 30-second version of what you do and why it matters in your own words, not the bio version. What is the problem you've made your life's work?
Well, to be honest, that intro you gave, that was one of the best bios I've ever had. So you'll have to send me that one because, I absolutely despise writing bios. So you did an unusually good job there. But I guess the way that I would frame it is I would pick up on one thing you said there, where you said that the true problem in most businesses, rather than the symptoms, is left untouched upstream. And that is exactly the story of 99% of businesses on the planet. Because the question of strategy, not for a particular part of the business, like, your social media strategy or something like that, but strategy for the business as a whole, this truly is a complete vacuum in most companies. Because most companies, they're not even really aware that it's a thing. It's not even something they're really aware that they need to do. And so they face all of these problems, all of these downstream tactical problems, like the ones that you described in the intro, just because nobody in the business ever stops to consider, hang on a second, what does this business actually do? And is that thing that it does something which has got super high leverage in the market or not? Because look, if we just step back and we think about it in very simple terms, if you had a business that was doing something that people really wanted, and you were the only business on the planet who they could get that thing from, then how difficult would it be to run that business? I mean, it would be a piece of piss, right? It would be like you couldn't help but succeed under those conditions. And so business strategy is about building a business that has those conditions. But the fact is that because most founders, most chief execs, they aren't actually even thinking about this question. They're thinking further downstream. They're thinking like, how do we improve our marketing? How do we improve our sales? How do we improve our product? But they aren't thinking at that higher level. They never address this fundamental question. And so their business is always running up against these frictions and problems, which are completely predictable if they ever step back from things. But to them, they don't notice. And so what I try to do with my work really is that a lot of it is about actually making capital B, capital S business strategy accessible, understandable, and exciting and interesting enough for people to actually engage with. And obviously the title of the book, No Bullshit Strategy, that sort of does what it says on the tin, right? That it's like maybe people are vaguely aware that this discipline exists in some kind of academic Harvard Business Review fashion. But what they need is a version of this that an actual working founder, CEO can just pick up and play with right away. That's the idea.
Alex, most CEOs and founders I speak with are trying to fix unpredictable revenue by improving their sales processes, hiring better people, or spending more on demand generation, generating interest in what they sell. None of it really produces lasting results. You've spent years working inside companies where this is the reality. In your experience, what is the actual root cause of unpredictable revenue in business to business, say a tech company? And why is it almost never what the CEO thinks it is?
I think that what happens to a lot of people is they fall into what I call the better trap, which is where they basically think that the success of a business is a function of how well they do things. So they think, how good is our product? How good is our marketing? How good is our sales, etc. And then if we do these things better than our competitors, then we will win. And this, of course, it sounds super logical. And so this is where most founders are, directing their energies. And to answer the unpredictable revenue thing that you're talking about, they are assuming maybe we're just not doing these things well enough. Maybe we need to try harder. Maybe we need to hire better people, etc., etc. Now, don't get me wrong. In some circumstances, it is possible that on these kind of basic tactical levels, the business is truly dropping the ball. They are truly doing something completely wrong. They're doing no marketing. They don't have enough salespeople. They're not putting enough volume of material out there, whatever. It is possible that they're just doing something really stupid, and if they did it well, then it would fix things. But the reality is that we have to assume very broadly that unless you're just like some tiny startup, if you're a proper business, like everybody is doing everything quite well. So like everybody is competent. If you've got a business that's actually earning money or has got a degree of investment, that's got a degree of scale, it's pretty likely that all of your functions are performing well enough to make you successful. And that just improving them, you're just fiddling around the edges. This is like optimization that couldn't possibly have a better than maybe a 5-10% uplift on your performance. And AI has made this situation 10 times worse, right? Because before AI, it was a little bit easier because you could see a lot of companies were doing things to a really inadequate level. So if you were just competent, if you were reasonably smart and diligent, sometimes that was indeed enough to give you competitive advantage. That was enough to get you an edge. Not being stupid was enough to get you an edge. But now anybody can get a 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10 result on most parts of their business just by consulting AI. We've got no more excuse anymore for lack of knowledge. So again, this is even worse. We have to assume that like the level of competition has flattened even more than it already was. So when we're in this situation, which I think most of the type of businesses you're talking about are, when we're in the situation when you can't get results by just improving what you're currently doing, the only other option that you have, but which is the option most people don't think about, is to think, all right, maybe it's not about improving what I'm doing. Maybe it's actually about doing something different. Maybe my business as it's currently set up and my offer as it's currently set up just doesn't actually have sufficient market traction. It doesn't have high enough demand, or maybe it does have high demand, but unfortunately there's a huge supply out there, so I've got too much competition offering the same thing. And therefore, no matter how hard I work and no matter how much I tweak these dials, I'm never going to deliver big changes in results because the business is already maxed out at its capacity. This fundamentally, the concept of what the business is doing is just not all that valuable. It doesn't have all that higher potential. This is the situation when the business needs to start thinking strategically. This is the situation where the founder needs to ask the question of, okay, how can we find some white space in our category where with our current systems and our current level of performance, we would actually then it would really start to click and it would really start to grow. So that's essentially where the kind of the strategic process and the strategic thinking comes in. But before you can do that, you've actually even got to be aware of the problem. And because people are stuck in this better trap, because people are still keep on thinking, we just need to be better, we just need to do things better, they never actually escape from this kind of vortex of mediocrity that they find themselves in.
Absolutely. You've written, and I found this genuinely surprising, that the real output of strategy work isn't a document or a slide deck. It's the internal clarity and confidence of the founder. So here's what I'd like you to walk me through. If a founder hasn't clearly decided what makes their company the only option worth buying, not the best, the only, does that fog travel downstream? Does it show up in how salespeople pitch, in why prospects go quiet after a demo, in why marketing feels inconsistent? Could you give me the mechanism? How does strategic fog in the founder's head become a revenue problem at the bottom of the pipeline?
Damn, it's even worse than that, because sometimes even if the founder is actually clear on this, even if the founder is strategically switched on and knows what needs to be done, even in those situations, there's often a huge amount of fog below them. Never mind the situations where the founder doesn't know themselves, because in those situations, yeah, it's obviously far worse. So basically, like, the way that you got to think about it is that the crux of strategy is answering the question, as you intimated, of what the unique value is that the business exists to provide. When you step back, every business is nothing more than a system that has been built to produce some sort of value. And that's the thing that it obviously sells to the market. And the amount of money that the business is going to get directly corresponds to the value that it produces. So the more that your system, the more that your business produces value, the more money it's going to collect. Super simple. So the entire focus of any business has to be to always be thinking, how do we produce more and more value? But you can't do that until you know what the value is that you're creating. You can't just say to your team, which is what people do say anyway, you can't just say, go out there and produce value, go out there and do something really great, because I wouldn't know where to begin, right? There's no specificity there. What the entire company fundamentally needs, and this is really what strategy is, they need a brief. They need a brief to say, right, the specific value that this business is built to generate is X. And all of you, when all's said and done, you only have one job here. Every single person in the company only has one job, and that is to produce as much of X as possible, as deeply and completely and charismatically as possible. Now, if every single person in the company knew what X was, regardless of what their job role was, they would be able to contextualize their job role within the production of that value. So to give you a kind of like an example that sort of makes it clear. If you think about some of the super iconic brands out there that everybody loves and talks about, so let's take, I don't know, if we think about someone like Red Bull or Patagonia or SpaceX or these type of companies, right? That everyone says, oh damn, I would really love to work for one of those companies. The reason that we feel that way is because these companies, what they do, the value that they produce, is so vivid and clear. Even from the outside, as just like casual observers, we can see what these companies' game is. And so we know that if I got plopped into one of those companies tomorrow as an employee, I'm not asking, wait, what are we doing here? I just know, because it's so clear in those companies. So everyone in those companies has basically been given this brief where they know what the game of the company is. And so that's why I said that, like, sometimes, even if the founder knows what the game is, even if they've got a super clear idea of the unique value that the business is putting out there, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has been disseminated to the whole organization in a way that they care about and understand. Because that's the other difficult thing about it as well, is that, like, you've also got to contend with the other barrier that most employees in teams, the truth is they actually don't care about what the strategy of the business is. They don't care about the trajectory of the business. At the end of the day, they're just collecting a paycheck. They're not paid to care. So as a founder, you don't only have to get over the hurdle of what is the strategy, what unique value can we put out there. You've also got to get over the hurdle of how do we make this digestible and understandable to our team, which is a whole nother job.
Would I be right in saying this is not just a strategy problem purely from the perspective of value? There's also a culture issue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is all wrapped up. This is actually something that I think in a lot of the sort of classical strategy books and theory you don't see enough of. So if you one way you can think about it is that like almost all strategy material you see out there is focused on the side of strategy, which is what should this business do? And that is obviously super important. That is absolutely fundamental to strategy. But actually, I think that it misses a whole nother equation. I think that strategy really is 50% deciding what the business should do, and it's 50% motivating people to actually go and do it. And what you just don't see any focus on this motivational part. But it's the motivational part that brings the energy and the clarity and the focus and the aggression and the understanding. Like, and so the companies that you see out there that truly dominate their markets, create categories of one and all the rest of it, you know, what you always see with these companies is they aren't necessarily the smartest companies who have got, let's say, the cleverest strategy on paper. They're the ones where there's a real sense of energy and dynamism among the team, and probably actually beyond the team, investors, press, stuff like that. You get into this situation where it's like the strategy gives them the direction, but the thing that's actually making them win is the intensity with which the business is delivering on the strategy. So like with my work, I try to think as much about how can we get people excited about the idea as I think about what is the actual idea itself.
I'd like to apply this thinking to perhaps a specific scenario in order to help us wrap our minds around this. And I think from your book and your past interviews, you do include some brilliant examples from consumer brands, Southwest Airlines, Domino's, Nintendo. In consumer businesses, the person who uses the product and the person who pays for it are usually the same individual. But in the B2B context, especially, say, a software company, the person who signs the contract is often a procurement team or a finance director. The person who uses the software daily is an employee who had no say in the purchase. And the person who decides whether to renew is often someone different again. So when you've got 3 or 4 people with 3 or 4 different definitions of value, how does the only not best principle, finding the one thing that only you can deliver, actually apply? Does one clear strategic position cut through all of them, or does it need to be adapted for each?
So obviously the answer is it depends, but to be more specific, so the first thing that is very important to understand, and this is something that people really struggle with, and I can understand why they do, is that we tend to think of value as being the value that a company creates. We tend to think of it as being wrapped up very intimately with the customer proposition, the offer that you give to the customers. And 9 times out of 10, it is, right? So like your strategy manifests in you offering something to the customer, which is unique and new and compelling. But we have to also bear in mind that there are other levers that we can pull in order to create value that the customer wouldn't necessarily be instantly aware of. So to give you one example, which is similar to what you're saying, albeit it's not in tech, but it has the same issue. So famously, like back in the day, Mars, as in like the chocolate company, they basically developed a cheaper way of manufacturing chocolate bars than their competitors. Now, what most companies would do in that scenario is they would get leverage from that innovation by just passing the saving on to the customer and selling the bars cheaper. But Mars didn't do that. What Mars did instead is they continued to sell the bars at the same price as everyone else, but they took the additional margin and they used it to basically buy shelf space with the supermarkets. So they literally paid the supermarkets to have the best shelf space. Now, this was an equally good strategy, but the end consumer, the user, never actually noticed this at all. This was actually really about them giving the way that they actually created value had nothing to do with the product itself. There's no special value in a Mars chocolate bar versus any other chocolate bar. The way that they produced value was by producing value within the retailer network. So in this instance, like when let's say a B2B tech company is thinking about like how they are going to produce new value, yes, of course, it's the first place that you would be looking is to like, can we produce a tool, piece of software or whatever that does something super valuable for customers that they haven't been able to do before? That's the first place you want to look. And if you can do that, then yeah, you should do that. But sometimes it doesn't work that way. Sometimes it might be that your product does basically the same thing as all of the other products do, but you are adding value somewhere else in the chain. You are doing something for one of those other parties who isn't the end user in the chain, and you're using that as your lever to get in. So I don't know, this is a really like stupid example because I'm just making it up. But let's say, I don't know, let's say you had a tool that was being used by the team in the client organization, but the buyer of the tool was, let's say, the HR team. So obviously in that situation, like really, I'm thinking that like it's first and foremost, it's always the buyer that we need to please. And normally in that situation, we would think, I'm going to convince the HR team to buy my product because the product does something awesome for the company. Now, you might do that, but that is probably less effective than actually building your strategy around pleasing the HR team and kind of screw the rest of the company. Maybe the actual product does something completely generic, but you know that because the leverage here is all about that relationship with the HR team, that is where you need to focus your strategy. So maybe what you actually end up doing is you end up, I don't know, making this up, you build in some piece of reporting into the tool which gives the HR team a lot of power within their organization, and the HR team want to use your tool, not the other tools, because it actually empowers HR, even though it doesn't make the blindest bit of difference to the end user. So I guess like what I'm trying to say here is that the points of leverage that a business has the potential points of leverage are far more numerous than just like, how do I do a good job for the end consumer? And this is where like the art of strategy comes in, but where people get themselves tied up in knots because they're always defaulting to how do we make the product do something that other products can't do? And especially in the world of tech, man, that is, people can iterate so quickly. How the hell are you ever going to build a product that can do stuff that other products can't do? You're probably not going to be able to do that. So in this situation, you need to be looking at non-product forms of leverage as the basis for your value creation, as the basis of your strategy. And I'll say one final thing here, just because this is something else where people might get confused. Okay, when we're thinking about the value that the company is producing, we have to work on the assumption that any value that we produce, which our competitors also produce, is zero value. It's meaningless. Of course, it isn't meaningless. There is still value in it for the customer. But from a competitive perspective, there is no value, right? The only thing that we get paid for, ever, is the new value that we create, right? So yes, your product creates all sorts of forms of value for the end user that is giving you no advantage whatsoever. The only bit of value that gives you advantage is the additional unique new value that you layer on top. So it's very important when you are thinking about your business not to recognize the difference between table stakes value that you're giving to the customer, which is very important, because if you didn't do that, then you wouldn't be bought, obviously. So I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but it's table stakes. You've got table stakes value, which we have to deliver, but then we write off. And then you've got the incremental new value that gives you the competitive advantage. So yeah, I can see that people, they get in a mess with these things. It's like, if you take a car brand, you could argue that every car needs to be able to get you from point A to point B. And if it didn't do that, then no one would buy it. But of course, we all understand that this is not any form of leverage to build a car brand on. So it's the same thing with every company. We need to be able to separate these different forms of value.
What you're describing can, at least from where I'm sitting and perhaps where some people listening in are sitting, become very complex very quickly. How would you help people separate signal from noise, so to speak, in order to gain clarity in the process of finding value that resonates? As you were speaking, I was thinking of an incident where a company was looking at a CRM system to replace their existing systems, and they had a few companies vying for the tender, and they lost out to toilet paper because Kleenex signed a deal for 10 years and agreed to pay for the CRM of their choice as long as they signed a deal for 10 years, which kind of resonates, I think, in my mind with what you're describing. But to think of that way is quite a leap for most of us. So how would you suggest we even wrap our minds around this realm of possibilities?
So I think that if we always take it back, it becomes complicated when you start to try and get clever with it. Whereas if you always take it back to first principles, it is never complicated. It's just extremely challenging. Because if we take it back to the first principles that I was talking about before, which is if you do something that the market wants, but no one else does, you will win. That, if you always have that in mind, you can never fail. So all of these examples that we're talking about, these all correspond to that principle. It's just that when we try to find an idea like that, for very obvious reasons, it's super difficult because these ideas are not obvious, because if they were obvious, then someone else would already be doing it. I think that 30 years ago, it was much more, you hear people say things like, talk to your customers, understand their needs, and then deliver on those needs. You should be doing this as a matter of routine, of course, but strategically, this is terrible advice, because you're never going to learn something that your competitors haven't already learned. Most markets are very mature now. So the reason that I come along and say, oh, hey, look, you just need to do something that people want, but that no one else is doing. The reason why this isn't super helpful advice is because instantly when you look for that thing, you have trouble finding it. And so that's why people have to start thinking much more creatively and start looking laterally for these opportunities. So to use your Kleenex example, I'm not sure, I know this isn't exactly what you're saying that they did, but it's still just like a funny one to play with. If I was a CRM company that didn't really have any product differentiation, it would be a pretty good idea. My strategy could completely revolve around building partnerships with companies like Kleenex and being smuggled into the companies for free through their relationship with their toilet paper company. This is a truly unique way of delivering value. The value for the end customer, obviously, is that they get their CRM for free. Amazing. The value for Kleenex is that they have this incredible additional bonus lever in order to sell in their completely commodity product, which is toilet paper. You're creating value all over the place with this. And so of course this would work well. But most people, they would never think of these opportunities to create value because they're so busy thinking, what does my customer want, and what are my customer needs, and what are the pain points, and blah, 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 blah. And they're looking in this area where all of their competitors are looking. And so they're never going to find these truly unique high leverage ideas. So it isn't complicated. In fact, nothing could be more simple. It's just we need to look for these opportunities in a way that most of us have not been trained to look for opportunities.
You've said that the best strategic insights come from informal, freewheeling conversations rather than structured workshops or customer surveys. Now, most strategy consultants I know would push back and pretty hard on that. They'd say you need data, detailed analysis, competitive research, etc. I want to understand exactly what you actually do. When you sit down with a CEO who's ready to do this work, who is the first person you talk to inside or outside the company? What is the one question you ask that almost always produces something the CEO didn't expect to hear? And how long does that discovery process take before you feel like you have enough to write a strategy that can actually guide decisions?
Oh, this is a good question off the back of what we were just talking about. So part of the reason why I don't take the sort of systematized workshopy type process is for the reason that I just described, which is that like all of those sort of strategy workshops, more or less, they are designed on the assumption, which was historically correct, that there are certain places where you can find competitive advantage. And if you look in those places, aha, there it is, you're going to find it. And again, I think that 15, 20, 30 years ago, this was roundly true because there was still this sort of low-hanging fruit waiting to be found. There isn't really a strategy process that could surface something like that Kleenex example that we just talked about because it's fundamentally too random. So what you need, in my view now, is a process that enables you to notice and surface unpredictable sources or opportunities for value. And I kind of work on the assumption with all of my work, and you could argue that sometimes this isn't correct, but it's mostly correct, that each company, they already have enough information. We're drowning in information. There's more than enough information in any company to have their strategic breakthrough. The problem is that they don't need more information. They just need a new way of looking at the information that they already have. And so my role in these sort of freewheeling conversations that you describe, which is how I do the kind of the actual sort of breakthrough part of the work, is if we just have, and this is really how I do it, funny as it sounds, if we just get together, me and the CEO or leadership team, whatever, in a really nice environment, you need to obviously be in some sort of like off-site environment, maybe you got like table service. I actually like to do the work in public, weirdly enough. Like I like to be in a public environment because it adds to the energy and it changes the whole dynamic of the conversation. And then if maybe for 2 hours, we just talk around the problem, around the business, have some laughs, have some jokes, go down random tangents, you would be amazed by how frequently the key bit of information that they were overlooking emerges. My role in that situation is that I basically know what strategy, I know what leverage looks like when I see it. Their role is that they know all the information. They know about the business, they know about the market, etc. We put those two things together. At some point in that conversation, somebody's going to say something and I'll be like, yeah, that thing that you said, what if we pull on that thread a bit? What if blah, 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 blah? And then you start to get into this new realm of territory, which not only has this business never explored before, but none of their competitors have ever explored before either. Now we're getting somewhere. Now we're into an interesting space. And so that's why I do it that way. And I do, you said, what's the first conversation? There are prior preparatory conversations. And sometimes the political situation in a business means that you have to do things a bit differently, that you have to involve more people in a different way. But if I had my way, basically, it sounds crazy, but if me and the CEO go and basically get some drinks and shoot the shit, 8-9 times out of 10, you get there by doing that. Of course, then after that, there's a whole big process of getting from that nugget of an idea to the results. That's a completely different story. But to get to that nugget of an idea, we have to break down the kind of on-rails thinking, which is most businesses day to day.
Could you give me an example of a surprising thing that came out of one of those conversations without naming the company, that the CEO had
Yeah.
completely missed until you asked the right question?
So let me see. I will give you a real example because then it's easier to talk about it. So one company that I worked with is their company called Little Dish, and they are the market leaders in kids ready meals, or like TV dinners. I don't know what they call them in different parts of the world, but like, a meal that you put in the microwave and it's already done for kids. So they were the market leaders in this, but it was a very small category all the same. And they had been at the same level for years. They'd been at a plateau because they'd already fulfilled essentially the market potential of that idea. And the question is, all right, how do we make this idea reach a much bigger market, a much wider market? Now, if we think about it from the point of view of value creation, the way that they were conceptualizing what the business's value was at the time, and in fairness to them, it was semi-unique already. They basically thought that this was like baby's first real meal. So they had these things like risotto, fish pie, stuff like that, but formulated in a way where 1 or 2-year-olds could eat it, like not too much salt, things like this. And it was an opportunity for parents to give their kids, grown-up food, essentially. And they had a tagline, proper food for kids. That sort of tells you how they were thinking about it. And there was a market for this, but it wasn't a very big market because it's quite a sort of luxury purchase. And so this wasn't enough to make this business and this category a really big category. So we were talking, and again, I can't remember exactly the flow of the conversation that came up to this, but what we discovered is they've been tracking they track the lifetime value of their different customers based on how old the kid is when they have their first meal. And all of their thinking was centered around the logical idea that the earlier that we get to the kid, the higher the lifetime value will be. So if a 1-year-old eats our food, they're going to have high lifetime value because we'll have them 1, 2, 3, 4 as they get older. And then at 5 or so, they age out of the brand. But when we talked about it, what we saw was that actually the lifetime value got higher the older the kid was when they came into the brand. So the lifetime value for a kid who has their first meal at 3 is higher than the lifetime value for a kid who has their first meal at 1. So you look at this, you're like, what the hell's going on there? So we just had to speculate, and we were like, let's think about what the difference is between a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. Now I've got kids in this zone, so I know all about this. So this was obviously very helpful. But obviously the founders, they had kids as well. Now 1-year-olds, they'll basically eat whatever you give them. They don't really have a mind of their own so much. By the time a kid is 3, they are a huge pain in the ass to feed. And so what we speculated was going on here is that when a parent of a 3-year-old gives the food to their kid, they're doing it because they're desperate. They're doing it because this annoying kid is fussy eater and they won't eat anything else. And they're thinking, maybe they'll eat this. And then if the kid does eat this, then the parent says, thank God for that. And they go out and they buy 100 of the product. Whereas the 1-year-olds, the parent's giving it to them not from a position of desperation. The parent's giving it to them more from a position of exploration. Like, hey, this might be interesting. This will be fun. Why don't we do this? So they do it, but it's not that big a deal. So we realize from thinking about it this way that, like, if we actually target the business not at 1-year-olds, but at 3-year-olds, because the whole thing was thought about, like, how can we make a product that's great for 1-year-olds so that they will age up with it? But then we thought, no, if we make a product that's great for 3-year-olds, and we had to do various changes to the product and branding, etc., to make this correct, then the thing is going to fly much more, because that is where we can generate a much higher intensity of demand. So basically, we made these changes, blah, 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 whatever they were, and that business 3x'd over the course of the next 18 months after having been plateaued for all of that time. So, we had the unlock, and then we applied it, and then boom, off we go up to the next threshold of growth. But I just want to point out to you here, to answer your question, that, like, what we discovered here, now I'm not saying that there is no methodology in the world that might have surfaced this. I'm sure there are some other methodologies that could have got us to the same answer. But just to say that the way that we arrived at it was discursive. It was through curiosity, and fundamentally, most importantly, it was through speculation. The strategic exercise is a speculative exercise. The strategic exercise is an exercise where you are riffing about what might be true in the future, because you can't judge it based on data from the past. Everything is speculative. Everything is a hypothesis where you say, maybe if we do this, it will work. But you never have any proof. We didn't have any proof there either. We were just speculating. And then when you put it out there, you're like, oh, great, our speculation was correct.
Okay. You say speculation, but I would say it's more of an educated guess coming from your own experiences and things of that nature. Brilliant.
There has to be some evidence, yeah.
One of the most counterintuitive things you argue is that being genuinely great at something requires consciously choosing to be bad at something else. That weakness is a deliberate strategic choice, not a failure of execution. Now, in a funded startup where every board meeting involves defending every metric and every investor wants to see growth on every front, how would you help a CEO make and then actually defend a deliberate choice to be weak somewhere? What does the conversation with the board look like? And what is the argument that actually lands with investors who are trained to see weakness as a risk?
That's an interesting question. I've never really thought about it that way. I think it's because people tend to talk about strategy as being like a bet or a gamble or a risk. And this is true insofar as what we just talked about with, you don't quite know how things are going to go because by definition, you're trying something new. However, what it doesn't mean is it doesn't mean that the idea that you're putting forward is like a complete like shot in the dark. As you said, we made an educated guess on that. And when we had that idea, to use that example, nobody had that idea before. But once you say the idea, anybody would say, oh, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. That's obvious. Yeah, sounds like a good idea. Like, so a good strategy, and this is a really funny thing, but it's always been my experience. A good strategy, although it's completely new, it also basically needs to be blindingly obvious. So I would suggest that if you get yourself into a situation where you are really having to defend your decision and people are skeptical of it and people are saying, why are you doing that? And then this is actually a bad sign for the strategy because like you need the idea to be similar to that little dish idea where when people hear it, 9 out of 10 people are going to be shit, that's a good idea. Yeah, let's do that. And then you're not going to be having this debate. No one's going to be questioning it. Nobody in Little Dish said, yes, but 1-year-olds, babies are very important to us. And I don't really want to risk doing something that might jeopardize our traction with babies. Like, nobody said that. Even though that was implicit in what we were doing, nobody ever brought it up because everyone was already thinking in the new way, and they were thinking, yeah, hell yeah, this just sounds better than what we were doing before. So yeah, I would take it as, if people are really pushing back on you, this is a pretty strong signal that you need to rethink the idea, because I will never push a strategy on my clients which I don't think is super obvious and can stand on its own 2 feet in an argument.
Have you ever seen a founder present a strategic trade-off to a board and have it received well? What made the difference?
So you remember when I said before about how strategy is 50% deciding what to do and 50% motivating people to do it? So that second 50% is the difference. You need, even in internal conversations, even with the board, everything is theatre. Everything is sales. We are all selling. We are all performing all the time. You need to get a sense of grandeur and narrative, and even, I would say, quest in your strategy, where you're explaining it to people in the format of, the basic narrative structure, I would say, is something it's always going to be something along the lines of, listen, here's the status quo. Here's why the status quo is actually stupid. Here is this thing that we've noticed and that no one else has noticed. And so here is this thing that we're going to do because of that. And here's what we think might happen. Right? So you're taking them on this sort of like journey like that. Every strategy can be explained basically in that sort of structure. If you explain the strategy in that structure, and the strategy can be applied to that structure, like, this is going to be the thing that makes people say, not just the board, but the team as well, that's going to make people say, hell yeah, let's do it. Everybody is a human being. Everybody is manipulated by the same things that they've been manipulated by for thousands of years, and so we've got to pull on those strings if we want to, not just with strategy but with any form of leadership. We have to inspire people to go with us.
You talked about motivation, and I can understand that, and to a degree inspiration as well. Assuming that you've got a CEO or a senior executive who is bought into this idea of strategy as you frame it, and is now wanting to create a culture of buy-in, given that there has been a lack of buy-in so far, what would you recommend?
So assuming that we got the idea, a process that would make sense would be something like this. Firstly, I would recommend informally socializing the idea amongst people who, stakeholders, people whose opinions really count. So like, before you've written anything or made a presentation or anything fancy like that, like, you've just got to go around, and how I was talking about that casual conversation. Yep. You need to have these conversations, but with more people, where you say to them, hey, listen, I was thinking about it this way. What do you think about this? Blah, 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 blah. So like, you've already made your mind up, but you're involving them in the process, and you're allowing them to get involved and to take ownership of it as well. I don't really believe in tapping into a big team for strategy generation. I don't actually think that's necessary. But for strategy socialization, you've obviously then got to do that. And these people are going to refine it, and they're going to improve it as you talk to them. Then the next thing you need to do, once you've got that kind of like informal buy-in, is you need to do some form of validation. And it's normally extremely easy to validate a strategy informally. How you do this is completely dependent on the specifics of the business in question. So, like, for example, if you're a business that is constantly pitching to customers, which a lot of B2B businesses, they have the advantage that they're constantly talking to customers, constantly pitching. It's very easy for you to implant some elements of the strategic thinking into your pitch, to tweak your pitch. I know that you haven't executed everything yet, but there will be elements that you can test run. And very quickly, you're going to see, is this easier or harder than what we were doing before? Does this interest the customer more or less than what we were doing before? So you need to find some form of informal validation process. And like almost always, you're going to pass the validation stage because you're moving from probably a sludgy position of non-strategy to a position of a degree of strategic focus. And even if the strategy is bad, that's still better than sludge strategy that you had before. Once you've got that bit of confidence, you then need to narrativize the strategy. So like I was saying, you need to basically do a sort of dumbed down, sexed up version of the strategy for the team, maybe for the board, for investors, stuff like that. You need to take those people as seriously as you would take your end consumers in an ad campaign. Like I said before, everybody's human, everybody's a person, we all respond to the same stuff. So you shouldn't assume that everybody is going to be interested in your strategy, and you shouldn't assume that everybody is going to understand your strategy. You need to think about what is the bare minimum vision that we can put forward to these people that will get them engaged in it. If I use the little dish example that I talked about before, I explained to you the strategic rationale for that decision. The team does not need to know that. The way that we explained it to the team is in a much more exciting and purposeful way, where we're basically like the way we said it to the team. So we know that the value we're trying to create is what that strategy does. If we think about it from the customer's perspective, is that we remove the stress from meal times. So to the team, we can start to talk about the strategy in a more mission-based format, where like we are here to make every mealtime that a parent has with their child be a source to be peaceful and joyful, not a source of extreme stress that it is in most households. And so we built the communication of the strategy around that, because that's something that anybody can relate to, anyone can empathize with, and it still got the team to understand what we were trying to do as a business. They didn't give a shit about any of this lifetime value stuff. We can care about that. The team doesn't need to know that. They just need to know this, like this more purposeful, exciting version of it. Then when you've got that, then of course you can start to make a big bang, and you can start to announce this change of direction to the organization. And then of course you want to be asking people in the organization, based on this idea in your part of the business, what else do you think that we could do to really drive at this new vision of the business? Of course, you've probably already got a plan, you've probably already got ideas, you know what needs to be done, but you can ask everyone thinking about this. If you're in, product development, like, what do you think that we could do that aligns with this strategy? And then people start having ideas. You're like, oh yeah, brilliant, yeah, let's do that. And you're starting to then build it in. And you can see now that we're moving into this position of momentum that your Red Bulls and your SpaceX or whatever, that they have, because everybody thinks that what the company's doing is cool and exciting and worthwhile, and they really understand it, and then they're applying their energies towards it. And then, if you do that, then you're really cooking.
Makes sense. I wonder how it applies as companies scale, because at, say, 10 employees, the founders in every conversation and the company's positioning is consistent because it's all flowing from one person. At 40 or 50 employees, that founder is no longer in the room. When a salesperson pitches to a new prospect, or when a customer success manager handles a renewal call, or when a new engineer decides what feature to prioritize. Now, you argue that a great strategy should be expressible in one clear sentence that anyone can understand and repeat. But What is the actual mechanism for getting that sentence to live in employee number 43 who joined 6 weeks ago? Concretely, not just repeated often. What do leaders specifically do to keep strategy alive as the company scales?
It's not a very satisfying answer, but beyond the stuff that I just said, ultimately, I think that the primary job of every leader, chief exec, is to be a propagandist. If you look at people like Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, what did these people really spend most of their time doing? They were propagandizing. Why can we now go onto YouTube and we can watch these amazing videos, internal videos of Steve Jobs talking to his marketing team from like 1987, and they're still fresh and exciting to watch today? Because Steve Jobs was a master of fundamentally just repeating himself, and we love to see it. And we've all seen the Jeff Bezos famous memos that he sends around the company where he's talking about customer obsession or whatever it was that he liked to talk about. Again, he was a propagandist. And I think that an unfortunate fact in what we're talking about here, and this is a hidden blocker to strategic traction, which nobody likes to talk about, but unfortunately I think it's true, which is that there are different types of leaders out there, right? And different types of leaders have got different types of strengths. And most leaders are fundamentally really glorified. They're not really leaders at all. They're managers. They're good at managing the machine of the company. But what we're talking about here is we're talking about setting out a new destination and leading, quite literally, taking the company to that new destination with you. And this requires a high degree of charisma, really. And it requires being a certain type of leader that not a lot of leaders are. Now, you can learn these skills to some extent, but I fully appreciate that it's not going to come naturally to most people, this kind of Jeff Bezos, Steve Jobs-esque inspirational leadership. But if you don't do that, if you don't become this propagandist within your organization, going around and repeating yourself 1,000 times a day in 1,000 different ways so that the ideas are running through every single employee like their DNA, then you will never get there. That's the unfortunate thing. So, and look, maybe, not, like I say, not every single business is strategic. Most businesses are not strategic, and most businesses are not really breaking any new ground in their category, and they're still perhaps perfectly profitable and they're still having a decent time. It might be that you just never really have what it takes to build a strategic business like this because you're too much of a kind of hands-on micromanager in your business, and you don't want to embrace the responsibility to be this kind of like narrative-driven leader. And maybe that's fine, but then you'll never get there.
Research on business-to-business buying behavior consistently shows that at any given moment, only 5% of your total addressable market, the universe of companies who could potentially buy from you, is actively evaluating purchase right now. The other 95% know a problem exists but aren't in buying mode. Most revenue conversations focus entirely on converting that active 5%. But I want to ask you something I don't think you've been asked before. Does your strategy need to work for the 95% who aren't ready to buy yet? Because if a company's positioning is unclear or generic, the 5% who are ready will struggle to choose them. But the 95% who aren't ready yet will never build the mental picture that puts this company at the top of their shortlist when they finally are. So how does strategic clarity, or the lack of it, affect a company's ability to build trust with people who aren't buyers yet?
You're right. I have never been asked that question before, and it's a good one. So let me see. What would be a universal answer to this question? So some of what you're talking about here is fundamentally a more of a marketing question than a strategy question, i.e., how do you keep yourself front of mind for a long enough period of time that you will still be front of mind when the moment comes to buy? And like I say, that's tactical marketing question. Very important though, something that most companies do a very bad job of, because you have to assume, it's different for every product of course, but you basically have to assume that the purchase cycle between someone first hearing from you and someone buying you is something like 2 years. So you have to think, right, how the hell do I stay in this person's consciousness for a period of 2 years? So that's something that you've got to do. So that's a marketing point, but it is something that people do badly. So I just say that first. Next, you see a lot now. I think you remember how I was saying before about how the low-hanging fruit has been picked, and it's quite hard to you can't just find some unmet customer need and answer it in a sort of straightforward linear way. Because of another consequence of this is that it has become easier in a lot of cases to create needs than it has become to answer them. Now, what I mean by that is that most business concepts or most businesses are built around this idea of customer needs X, I will therefore create X, and when customer comes into that buying moment, there I will be ready to answer that issue. The problem is that is obviously extremely crowded because everybody knows that customer needs X, and so you get loads and loads of businesses sitting there and you don't have any more real market opportunity there. So what most good strategy in 2026 looks like is it's more about actually coming up with something that nobody is asking for and that nobody knows that they want, but when they see that thing, then they will want it, right? So this is what I mean by creating needs. You don't look for questions customers are currently answering. You think to yourself, basically, what would be really cool, but that nobody's thought of yet? And then when I show it to them, they'll be like, oh, I want that. Now, a basic example of this would be something like, I wonder if I can give you a tech example. So let's say, I don't know, like I use the platform Circle, which is like a sort of community building platform. Now, there was a time when community building platforms like Circle didn't exist, right? So this was, I don't know when it came out, but this probably 3, 4, 5 years ago, this wasn't a concept. Now, probably most people were not thinking, geez, I really wish that I could build a community around my business, because it just wasn't in their frame of reference. But then when a company like Circle came along and said, effectively they say, hey, look at this, now you can build a community. Suddenly, someone like me thinks, shit, I could build a community. Actually, that would be really cool. So this is what I mean by they created the need, right? Before they existed, there was no need there. They were not answering an obvious need that people had in their heads. So this is, I think, normally now, this is the more effective game to play. And so if you think in terms of creating needs, this actually gives you the opportunity to get in front of customers outside of that normal buying moment, or it gives you the opportunity to speak to customers who before were never necessarily considering your category. So it's like, I don't know, like a basic example I use for this is like, this is very basic, but you'll understand what I mean. If you think about curry paste, right? There is a market of people out there who already buy curry paste, people who cook curries, and every now and again they think, oh, I'm going to cook a curry, let's buy some curry paste, right? So then that's the product, that's the moment. But what if I created a curry paste and I built my entire strategy around essentially convincing people who don't cook curries to cook curries? If I did that, I'm going to be speaking to a completely new audience who are not in the mind space of cooking curries. But then if I convince some of them to cook a curry, I'm going to be the only curry paste that they consider, because they've never even heard of the other curry pastes, because they're not in the market for curry pastes. So again, this is another example of creating a need, a new need, rather than answering a need in people. So yeah, the tactical answer to your question is, how do you keep in the eye line of the customer for a very long period of time? The strategic answer to the question is, how do you create a new need in your category, which when people see it, it will actually push them into that buying motion, which they wouldn't have otherwise entered.
If I could phrase this perhaps a little bit differently, you're looking for that white space or that blue ocean space in order to define your category.
Yes, you are. Although it does get a bit messy in a sense, because using the curry paste example, obviously this new curry paste brand that I create, it's still a curry space. It's still a curry paste. It still exists within the curry paste market. So it isn't really blue ocean. But let's go back to our first principles. It is bringing a new form of value to that market. And that is what's giving it the leverage. Yes, it's white space, but it isn't like the creation of a completely new category. Trader Joe's is an incredible strategic success story. They brought something completely new to the world of groceries, but did they create a new category? I would argue no. Instead, they brought new value to an existing category. So, but it's all semantics at this point, because some people would say that is a new category, some people say it isn't. I don't know, but you get my point.
There's a connection I want to make explicit and get your reaction to, and we're heading towards wrapping up. The companies I observe with the strongest inbound pipeline, meaning prospects who arrived already qualified and already wanting to buy, are almost always companies whose founder has been consistently publishing a specific opinionated point of view over time. Maybe it's a newsletter, perhaps a podcast, a series of frameworks, a well-known way of thinking about a problem. They're not just marketing, they're actively teaching the market how to think about the problem their product solves. In your view, is consistent educational publishing actually one of the most underrated ways to make a business-to-business strategy durable and to turn it into a revenue advantage that compounds over time?
Yes, I would say it is, although I slightly hesitate because I don't know how underrated it is these days. Now that AI makes content creation very easy, it has created a real saturation problem out there in the market. So, but that again, that's more of a tactical thing. But what I like about the question is that yes, we are, again, this is another consequence of the era that we live in, of this hyper-competitive, oversaturated era. We are often we're moving beyond a world where you could sort of make a good product that solves a problem for people that they hadn't had solved before. That world is ending. And so in that situation, when all the problems have been solved, you think to yourself, shit, what else do I do now? I talked a little bit about creating needs a second ago. But the other thing that you do is that basically businesses now have to compete with each other through worldview, through point of view, through actually maybe there are 10 businesses that all do a similar thing. But the grounds by which they compete is which one is giving me the most compelling vision of my problem or compelling vision of the future. Which one do I vibe with? This is super important in most industries now. Not all. There are some industries where the product is so boring that I just don't give a shit what they say, because it's a deep commodity. But the type of businesses you're talking about are not going to be in that space. And so it becomes, so absolutely everybody should be thinking not about strategy, not only in terms of features and benefits and market position and that kind of thing, but they should also be thinking about things much more philosophically. And they should be the more that you can bring, this is a weird thing that's happened in recent times, the more that you can bring a person to the front and a founder to the front and the opinions of that founder, the better it's going to work. look, with the biggest businesses on the planet, like it, love him or hate him, like Elon Musk is a very clear face of Tesla and of SpaceX. Now, your business is not bigger than Tesla and SpaceX. So if even they can have a face-led, opinion-led, founder-led identity, your business can certainly have that. Like, I think people get in this situation where they think, oh, my business is too big or too professional to be opinionated. That is a huge error because, like I say, you're not bigger than SpaceX. So it's super underleveraged for most businesses. But it also does come back to that thing that we were saying before, that some founders, they don't want to do that. They don't want to be leading from the front, so to speak. They don't want to be famous or known, which is completely fine. But it makes your job a little bit harder because if you're prepared to play that game, it's an extra competitive lever. And why wouldn't we want all of the competitive levers that we can possibly have?
I can see how AI and things can certainly amplify a message. What advice would you give to a leader to do a bit of a stock take to ensure that they are able to form an opinion which adds value to the people that they would want to resonate with?
Yeah, that's interesting. So when all is said and done, these opinions, they typically rest on a disagreement with the status quo of the category in question. This is actually a great discipline for strategy development, in addition to, building media presence, right? So the big problem that most founders have is that they spend all of their time looking down into their business. They're thinking about their business, they're thinking about their product, they're thinking about their customers, they're thinking about all this stuff in their little bubble. What they're never doing is looking up and out and thinking about how their business sits in a bigger context, in the context of their category, in the context of their industry, and in the context of the world at large. So, if you're a CRM, right, there's the question of how does our CRM sit within the world of CRMs? There's the question of how does our CRM sit within the world of software or something? And then there's the context of how does CRM sit in the universe, kind of thing, as you keep on zooming out. Where a founder's gaze should spend most of its time is not down on their business. It should spend most of its time out looking at the contextual landscape. And when you then start to look at the landscape, this is where you can start to develop opinions about the landscape, and you can start to develop opinions about where it's going. And basically, you want to have an opinion that is something along the lines of, everybody in our industry seems to think X, but what we think is Y. And let me tell you why. You can only develop an opinion like that if you actually have an opinion on your broader industry. And unfortunately, most people don't have an opinion on their broader industries because they never think about it. I mean, to use myself as an example, not that I'm the ultimate sort of success story, but most of the stuff that I write about, obviously, given what I do, is I'm looking out there at the strategy world and at the business landscape, and I'm looking at how things are moving, and I'm saying what I see. And so that's where it becomes valuable to the audience, because you're taking that bigger picture viewpoint. So bottom line, this is how founders need to be thinking and talking. They've got to stop focusing on their business all the time. They've got to be thinking about the movements of their industry. That is the interesting thing. If you have an advertising agency, you should always be talking about, here is how the advertising world is moving, and here's what I think about it. If you have a CRM, you should always be talking about, here is how CRMs are changing, here is how software is changing, here's what we think about that, here's where we think people are getting things wrong. You've got to become a student of your industry.
Alex, for a founder or a CEO listening to this right now, they've raised at least one round of funding. They have a product in market that customers are using. But if you asked five people on their team what makes them different from their three closest competitors, you'd probably get five different answers. What is the single most important thing they should do in the next 7 days to start getting clear? Not a framework, not a book recommendation, something specific they can actually do this week.
So obviously that's a business that's in that sort of like unstrategic sludge stage. So I reckon that I think the first thing that they need to do is they need to sit down and they need to ask the question, put the leadership team together, ask the question in the room, what is the likelihood that we are going to 3x in the next 12 months? As things currently stand, if nothing changes, is this possible? Now, the reason that you're asking this is that you got like a few possibilities here. First possibility is that you say, actually, we're already on a trajectory to do that because we're growing hand over fist. If you're growing so bloody amazingly, then obviously for now, you just want to keep doing what you're doing, but you need to be very clear on why things are working and where your success is coming from. But the good news is that something is working. And so you need to say, we're already on course for this. Why are we on course for this? And when you know what that thing is, bam, there's your strategy for the short term. It is to focus all your energies into that. Problem solved. Now, it's very unlikely that you are on that trajectory. The other likely answers are either you think maybe if things go our way, this could happen, or you think, no, at the moment that isn't really like realistic. It's not realistic that something like that could happen. Now, the challenge that I would put to you is that every single business out there needs to be making a play in the market that makes it possible, not inevitable, but possible to 3x over the next 12 months. If you think that this is simply not possible, that is a sign that your business is not actually taking enough positive moves in the market. Every business should be making positive moves, and that is a sign that you are not making big enough positive moves. If you reveal to yourself that this cannot happen, 3x in 12 months, if you see that this is true, then you need to take this as a wake-up call to actually think, all right, what would we have to do in order to make this at least a possibility? And once you start having that question, things are going to start falling into place. Because if you set yourself a very high target like that, a very high standard, then, and you don't stop thinking until you get to a point where you're like, yes, okay, if we do, this is possible. Until you get to that point, like basically it's a way of forcing yourself to start to have a strategic conversation. And now what you do after that, yes, there's all methodologies and frameworks, like you said, sort of doesn't matter. At least now you're having the conversation. And the main issue that most companies have is that they are not even having the conversation in the first place. So that is your first job. Start having that conversation.
Brilliant. Before I let you go, I'd like to ask this final question. I ask it because I think it's perhaps an honest test of any framework. Alex, you work with companies to help them identify the one thing that only they can deliver, the position that makes them irreplaceable. What is yours, and what have you deliberately chosen not to be in order to be what you are? And does articulating your own only ever feel as uncomfortable as it does for the founders you work with?
Yes, it is horrible. Now, I suppose the one advantage that I have is that because this is a bit of a cop. I will answer the question, but first, this is a bit of a cop out that like, so if you are intuitively living this stuff, like to some extent it becomes fairly organic. If we take, I mean, of course, I would never put myself into their class, But if we take the legendary strategic founders like your Elon Musks and your Steve... No, Elon Musk, he actually did do it. He's not a good example. Your Steve Jobs and people like this, they were doing strategy, but they never necessarily had a sentence on a piece of paper that is like, my strategy is blah, blah, blah. They didn't need to because it was so implicitly embedded into the whole way that they were running the organization. So they never was put on the spot. A lot of these frameworks and ways of thinking about it, these are ways of forcing unstrategic people to think strategically, if that makes sense. So for that reason, and also bear in mind that I don't have a big team, like I've never had to write down the strategy is X, because it's all in my head. I'm not disseminating it to other people. However, that being said, that there are lots of things, lots of different angles here that I use for this. So as I said to you at the outset, like a huge part of my strategy up to this point, and I'm starting to change it a little bit, has been fundamentally making strategy more interesting and accessible for people than all that sort of Harvard Business Review stuff that existed in the past. And I think I've done a good job of this, and like I have brought this thinking to a wider audience. For example, one big sacrifice that I make within that, like some people might say that I dumb down some elements of strategy, and fundamentally I do, because I believe something that is broadly true and usable is far more useful for people than something that is precisely true but not usable. And so much of the whole strategy industry, it's all a little bit like wonkish. Right? They really care about everything being super accurate. Whereas I'm like, if you just understand some basic principles and you operate to those basic principles, you are going to be so far ahead of the competition. And that's all that really matters, right? You don't need to do great textbook strategy. You just need to be slightly better than your competitor. So this is a way that I approach strategy, which is not the way that the strategy industry, such as it is, approaches strategy. So this would be an example of my kind of sacrifice. I'm prepared to be a little bit more of a dummy if it's actually going to make more people bloody well do this stuff, because the issue isn't that they're doing it badly, the issue is that they're not doing it at all. So that's central to where I've been. Now I'm starting to change things a little bit. The new era of my career is a little bit less focused on helping people grasp the principles. And what I'm more interested in now is how the business landscape has changed massively in the last couple of years, thanks not only to AI, but a whole bunch of other sort of factors, that is bringing us into a new era of competition, where I believe that some of the old strategy principles don't really work anymore, or they don't work as well as they used to. And I think that we need to have a new understanding of strategy for this era of hyper competition, where the businesses are fundamentally completely unprepared for, and they're feeling the effects of it right now, but they can't explain why. They feel that things are getting harder. They feel that things are not working as well as they used to, and they don't really understand what's going on. And so I want to help people understand these dynamics and see how to respond to them. So this is a kind of new territory for my business.
I wish we had more time to dive in a little bit deeper, but Alex, this has been exactly the kind of conversation I knew it would be: genuinely useful, genuinely uncomfortable in the best way. Where should founders go if they want to go deeper on this work?
So I got a lot of people following me on LinkedIn, so you can check me out there. Would be a very basic thing. I'm Alex M.H. Smith, because if you just search Alex Smith, there's too many Alex Smiths, and so that's why I have to do the M.H. thing. But then better than that is the book basically tells you everything you need to know in 138 pages. It's super short, super easy. No Bullshit Strategy is definitely the best resource. And then more long-term, my Substack, which is called The Rare Mind. If you subscribe to that, you can just search The Rare Mind Substack or something like that. Every week I'm writing essays about these topics. That's all about, as the name implies, it's about helping you think in a way that your competitors are not thinking right now. Because as competence is fucking sorry, racing to zero now. We're getting to the point where the only real competitive advantage that I think that anybody has is fundamentally the way that they are thinking. And so that's what I'm trying to help people with that Substack. So subscribe to that.
We'll include links to those in the show notes. Alex, thank you so much for doing this.
It was a pleasure, mate.